Imagine living for almost 1,000 years. While today we celebrate those who reach 100, the first men of the Bible lived for entire centuries. Methuselah, the longest living man in history, witnessed 969 years of civilization. He saw more than 10 generations come and go. Adam, the first man, ruled over the earth for 930 years as the supreme patriarch of humanity. Noah, the hero of the Great Flood, spanned two completely different eras during his epic 950-year life. These weren't ordinary men. They were giants of their time, living legends who shaped history for centuries. But what was their secret? Why did they live so long, and we don't? The answer will shock you. Today, you'll uncover the mysteries behind the extraordinary longevity of the biblical patriarchs. The story began with Adam, the first man created by God's own hands. He wasn't just the father of humanity, he was also its first king, living almost 1,000 years upon the earth. The book of Genesis, in chapter 5, verse 5, tells us that all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Imagine that, 930 years. Adam saw his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and many other generations grow up before his eyes. He was like a living library, keeping the memories of paradise, knowing every secret of creation. For almost a millennium, Adam was the bridge between the perfect world he knew in Eden and the reality his descendants faced. His longevity wasn't just a number, it was a living testimony of man's original greatness. Adam could tell stories that spanned centuries, sharing wisdom gained through direct experience with the Creator himself. When Adam spoke, people listened with reverence because his words carried the weight of nearly 1,000 years of experience. He remembered the sound of God's voice in the garden, the feel of perfect communion with the divine, and the bitter taste of that first bite of forbidden fruit. Adam's 930 years allowed him to watch human civilization take its first steps. He saw the development of agriculture, the birth of cities, the invention of tools and musical instruments. Yet through all these changes, Adam remained the ultimate authority on what life was like before sin entered the world. His stories of Eden weren't just memories. They were living testimonies of God's original design for humanity. Adam's extraordinary lifespan meant that for nearly a millennium, the human race had direct access to someone who had walked with God in perfect innocence. After Abel's death and Cain's exile, God gave Adam another special son, Seth. This man became the hope of the godly lineage, and his life was equally extraordinary. Genesis 5:8 records that all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Seth lived 912 years, only 18 years less than his father Adam. Through him, the line of the righteous continued on earth. Seth wasn't just a replacement for Abel. He was God's chosen one to keep the true faith alive. His longevity allowed him to mentor countless generations, passing down not just knowledge, but also worship of the true God. During his 9 centuries of life, Seth became the patriarch of a family that sought the Lord. He watched civilizations rise and change, always maintaining the pure worship that had been established since the beginning. Seth's nearly 1,000 years were spent building a legacy of faith that would endure through the ages. While his brother Cain's descendants were busy building cities and advancing technology, Seth focused on something far more important: preserving the knowledge of God. His 912 years gave him time to establish strong spiritual foundations in his family line. Seth understood that longevity was a gift from God, not just for personal enjoyment, but for the preservation of truth. He used every one of his 912 years to ensure that future generations would know their Creator. Seth's long life allowed him to see the consequences of both righteousness and wickedness play out over centuries. He witnessed how the godly line flourished under divine blessing, while the ungodly line of Cain grew increasingly corrupt. Seth's wisdom, accumulated over 9 centuries, made him a revered figure who could speak with authority about the ways of God. His descendants looked to him not just as a patriarch, but as a living link to the time when God walked with man in the garden. It was during the time of Enosh, Seth's son, that something remarkable happened in human history. Enosh lived 905 years, as Genesis 5:11 tells us. All the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. But his importance goes beyond longevity. It was during his lifetime that people began to call upon the name of the Lord in an organized way. Genesis 4:26 tells us that to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Enosh witnessed the birth of collective worship, seeing how his descendants gathered to seek God. During his 9 centuries, he was like a spiritual shepherd, guiding people in their search for the Creator. His long life meant he could establish traditions of worship that would last for generations. Enosh saw the early development of human civilization while maintaining the spiritual foundation that connected humanity to its Creator. The phrase "began to call upon the name of the Lord" during Enosh's time suggests that formal worship services started during his 905 years of life. This wasn't just individual prayer. This was organized, communal worship where people gathered together to seek God. Enosh's extraordinary lifespan allowed him to refine and perfect these worship practices. For over 9 centuries, he served as both a spiritual leader and a living example of what it meant to seek God earnestly. Enosh's long life coincided with a time when humanity was beginning to spread across the earth, and he made sure that wherever his descendants went, they carried with them the knowledge of how to call upon the name of the Lord. His 905 years were invested in creating a culture of worship that would survive for generations. Enosh understood that his longevity was a divine gift that came with great responsibility, the responsibility to teach others how to maintain a relationship with their Creator. The lineage continued with Canaan, who lived 910 years. Genesis 5:14 records, "All the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died." Canaan represented the continuity of faith through generations. His life of more than 9 centuries was proof that God was preserving the line of the righteous. He saw hundreds of descendants born and grow up, all carrying the spiritual heritage that came from Adam. Canaan wasn't just a link in the genealogical chain, he was a guardian of faith, keeping God's memory alive at a time when the world was beginning to turn away from the Creator. His 910 years were invested in forming a family that honored the Lord. Canaan witnessed the expansion of human knowledge and skills, but never lost sight of what truly mattered, maintaining a relationship with the Almighty. His century-spanning wisdom helped guide his family through the challenges of a changing world. During Canaan's 910 years, he saw human civilization become increasingly complex. Technology advanced, cities grew larger, and society became more sophisticated. Yet through all these changes, Canaan remained focused on the spiritual education of his descendants. His long life allowed him to personally mentor multiple generations, ensuring that the knowledge of God wasn't lost amid the distractions of progress. Canaan's 910 years were like a steady lighthouse beam, providing constant guidance to his family in an increasingly turbulent world. He had the unique perspective of someone who could see the long-term consequences of choices, having witnessed how decisions made in one generation affected the next. Canaan's extraordinary longevity made him a living bridge between the ancient world and the developing civilization of his time. His descendants knew that when Canaan spoke, they were hearing from someone who had observed the rise and fall of entire movements, the birth and death of thousands of people, and the slow but steady changes that shaped human society. Mahalil came next, living 895 years. According to Genesis 5:17, all the days of Mahalil were 895 years, and he died. Although he lived a few years less than his predecessors, Mahalil still enjoyed almost 9 centuries of life. His name means praise of God, and his existence was exactly that, continuous praise to the Creator. For almost 900 years, Mahalil kept the flame of godliness burning in his family. He educated children, grandchildren, and many other generations in the ways of the Lord. His longevity allowed him to be like a spiritual lighthouse, guiding his descendants in their search for God at a time when evil was beginning to spread across the earth. Mahalalel's long life was a testament to God's faithfulness, showing that those who remained devoted to him could experience his blessings for centuries. He became a living example of what it meant to live a life wholly dedicated to praising the Creator. The meaning of Mahalalel's name, praise of God, perfectly captured the essence of his 895-year life. Every day for almost 9 centuries, Mahalalel lived up to his name by maintaining a heart of worship and praise. His longevity allowed him to develop a depth of spiritual maturity that was unmatched in his generation. Mahalalel's 895 years were spent not just in personal devotion, but in teaching others how to praise God with sincerity and passion. He understood that worship wasn't just about rituals or ceremonies. It was about maintaining a heart attitude of reverence and gratitude toward the Creator. Mahalalel's long life coincided with a time when the world was beginning to show signs of moral decay, making his consistent praise and worship even more significant. He stood as a beacon of righteousness in an increasingly dark world, showing that it was still possible to live a life that honored God. Mahalalel's 895 years of faithful praise created a legacy that would inspire his descendants for generations to come. Then came Jared, whose name means descent. He lived 962 years, becoming the second longest-lived man before the flood. Genesis 5:20 declares, "All the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died." Jared was the father of Enoch and grandfather of Methuselah. During his 962 years, he witnessed some of the most important transformations in ancient history. His extraordinary longevity placed him as a bridge between different eras, seeing entire generations born, grow, and pass away. Jared wasn't just a patriarch. He was a living witness to God's faithfulness through the centuries. His nearly 1,000 years of life were invested in forming a family that sought the Lord with sincerity. Jared lived through times of great change in human civilization, yet maintained the spiritual foundations that had been established by his ancestors. His wisdom, accumulated over nearly a millennium, made him a revered figure among his descendants. Jared's 962 years made him the second longest-lived person in human history before the flood. His name, meaning descent, proved to be prophetic as he lived to see the moral descent of humanity as wickedness began to increase on the earth. Yet Jared himself never descended from his commitment to God. For 962 years, he remained faithful to the principles that had been passed down from Adam through Seth, Enosh, Canaan, and Mahalil. Jared's extraordinary lifespan allowed him to serve as a repository of wisdom and knowledge for his entire civilization. People would travel great distances to seek his counsel, knowing that his words carried the weight of nearly 1,000 years of experience. Jared's 962 years encompassed the entire lifetime of many of his descendants, making him a constant presence in their lives. His longevity meant that multiple generations of his family could receive direct instruction from him, ensuring that the knowledge of God was preserved and passed down accurately. Jared's nearly 1,000 years of life were a testament to God's patience and mercy during a time when humanity was beginning to stray from its Creator. But among all these extraordinary men, Enoch stood out in a unique way. He lived only 365 years, much less than his contemporaries. However, Genesis 5:24 tells us something amazing. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch didn't die like the others. Hebrews 11:5 explains, "By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God." During his 365 years, Enoch had a unique intimacy with the Creator. He literally walked with God, maintaining such close communion that God decided to take him without experiencing death. Enoch became living proof that it's possible to live in perfect harmony with the Creator. His translation to heaven without dying was unprecedented and would not be repeated until Elijah centuries later. Enoch's relatively short but perfect life showed that quality of relationship with God mattered more than quantity of years. While his father Jared lived 962 years, and his son Methuselah would live 969 years, Enoch's 365 years were so perfectly lived that God took him directly to heaven. The phrase, "walked with God," suggests a level of intimacy and communion that was extraordinary even for that time period. Enoch's 365 years were spent in such close fellowship with God that the boundary between earth and heaven became thin in his life. His daily walks with God weren't just spiritual exercises, they were literal experiences of divine communion. Enoch's short but perfect life became a powerful testimony to his descendants about what was truly possible in a relationship with God. While others were living for centuries, Enoch was living for eternity. His translation without death sent a clear message to the ancient world that God was still accessible, still interested in intimate relationship with humanity, and still capable of supernatural intervention in human affairs. Enoch's 365 years proved that it was possible to please God so completely that heaven became more real than earth. And finally we come to Methuselah, the man who broke all longevity records. Son of Enoch, he lived an incredible 969 years. Genesis 5:27 records, "All the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died." Methuselah wasn't just the longest-lived man in history. He was a living witness to almost 1,000 years of civilization. He saw dozens of generations born, grow, and die. During his 969 years, Methuselah accumulated more experience and wisdom than any other human being. His name became synonymous with extreme longevity. Methuselah died in the same year as the flood, as if God had preserved his life until the last possible moment before judgment. His almost 1,000 years were the final breath of the golden age of human longevity. Methuselah's life spanned the entire antediluvian period, making him the ultimate witness to humanity's early history. The significance of Methuselah's 969 years cannot be overstated. He was born during the time of Adam and lived until the year of Noah's flood. This means Methuselah personally knew Adam for 243 years and was still alive when Noah was born. His 969 years made him a living link between the very beginning of human history and its first great reset. Methuselah's extraordinary longevity allowed him to observe the complete moral decline of humanity, from its relatively innocent beginnings to the wickedness that ultimately brought God's judgment. For 969 years, Methuselah watched as the world gradually turned away from its creator. He saw the development of violence, corruption, and every form of evil that finally grieved God's heart. Yet Methuselah himself remained faithful throughout his nearly 1,000 years of life. His longevity was both a blessing and a burden. A blessing because it allowed him to accumulate unparalleled wisdom and experience, but a burden because he had to watch the world he loved slowly descend into chaos. Methuselah's 969 years ended in the same year that God's judgment fell upon the earth through the Great Flood, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The world that existed before the Great Flood was nothing like the world we know today. It was a paradise designed for life to flourish, where everything worked in perfect harmony to support human longevity. Genesis 2:8 tells us that the Lord, God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. This wasn't just any garden. This was the perfect environment created by God himself. Eden represented the ideal conditions that God intended for all of creation. The garden was filled with every tree that was pleasant to sight and good for food, as Genesis 2:9 describes, "And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." Eden was designed as a template for what the entire earth could become. The perfect balance of beauty, nutrition, and life-sustaining elements made Eden the ultimate environment for human flourishing. The garden had rivers flowing through it, providing constant irrigation and creating the perfect humidity levels. Genesis 2:10 tells us that a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. This river system ensured that every part of Eden received exactly the right amount of water. The soil was rich and fertile, producing abundant food without the need for hard labor. The temperature was perfectly regulated, the air was pure and clean, and everything was designed to sustain life indefinitely. Adam and Eve didn't just live in Eden, they thrived in it, experiencing none of the environmental stresses that would later shorten human life. In this pristine world, disease and sickness were completely unknown. The human body functioned exactly as God designed it, without any malfunction or breakdown. There were no viruses, no bacteria causing infections, no genetic disorders, and no degenerative diseases. Genesis 1:31 tells us that when God looked at everything he had made, including man, behold, it was very good. The phrase very good in Hebrew suggests perfection and complete functionality. The human immune system worked flawlessly. The organs functioned at optimal capacity, and the body's ability to heal and regenerate was extraordinary. People didn't suffer from cancer, heart disease, arthritis, or any of the thousands of ailments that plague humanity today. The absence of disease meant that the natural aging process was incredibly slow. Cells regenerated efficiently, organs maintained their strength, and the body's systems continued to work in perfect harmony for centuries. Without the constant assault of diseases and environmental toxins, the human body could focus all its energy on maintaining life and vitality. The genetic code functioned exactly as intended, producing strong, healthy bodies that could sustain life for nearly 1,000 years. This disease-free environment was one of the key factors that allowed the early patriarchs to live such extraordinarily long lives. One of the most significant differences in the pre-flood world was the atmospheric conditions. Many biblical scholars believe that Genesis 1:6-7 describes a unique atmospheric structure, and God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. This suggests that there was a canopy of water vapor surrounding the earth, creating a protective shield around the planet. This vapor canopy would have filtered out harmful cosmic radiation and ultraviolet rays that damage DNA and accelerate aging. The protective effect of this atmospheric shield cannot be overstated. Cosmic radiation constantly bombards our planet today, causing genetic mutations and cellular damage that contribute to aging and disease. But in the pre-flood world, this vapor canopy acted like a natural shield, protecting all life on Earth. From these harmful radiations, the atmospheric pressure would have been higher, allowing for more efficient oxygen distribution throughout the body. This enhanced oxygen environment would have boosted cellular metabolism, improved healing, and increased overall vitality. The vapor canopy also created a greenhouse effect that maintained stable temperatures worldwide, eliminating the extreme weather conditions that stress the human body today. The original diet that God prescribed for humanity was completely plant-based and perfectly designed for optimal health and longevity. Genesis 1:29 records God's original dietary plan. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat." This wasn't just any vegetation, this was perfectly designed plant food that provided every nutrient the human body needed. The fruits and vegetables in the pre-flood world were far superior to anything we have today. They were larger, more nutritious, and perfectly balanced in their mineral and vitamin content. The soil was rich with all the trace elements needed for optimal plant nutrition, which in turn provided optimal human nutrition. This plant-based diet was free from the harmful effects of processed foods, artificial additives, and the contamination that affects our food supply today. The antioxidants in these perfect plants provided powerful protection against cellular damage and aging. The fiber content supported perfect digestive health, and the natural enzymes aided in optimal nutrient absorption. This diet, combined with the pure environment, provided everything the human body needed, not just to survive, but to thrive for centuries. The absence of meat in the original diet eliminated exposure to diseases that can be transmitted from animals, and the perfect nutritional balance supported the body's amazing ability to regenerate and repair itself over hundreds of years. The genetic makeup of early humans was pristine and uncompromised. Adam and Eve were created with perfect DNA, free from any genetic defects or mutations. As Genesis 1:27 tells us, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." Being created in God's image meant genetic perfection. There were no inherited diseases, no genetic predispositions to illness, and no chromosomal abnormalities. The gene pool was pure and strong, capable of supporting incredibly long lifespans. Each generation that followed Adam and Eve inherited this genetic excellence, at least for the first several centuries. The absence of environmental toxins, radiation damage, and viral infections meant that genetic mutations were extremely rare. The DNA repair mechanisms in cells functioned perfectly, maintaining genetic integrity generation after generation. This genetic purity was crucial for the extraordinary longevity we see in the early patriarchs. Modern humans inherit thousands of years of accumulated genetic damage, but the early generations started with perfect genetic material and lived in an environment that preserved that perfection. The marriage between close relatives in early generations wasn't problematic because there were no genetic defects to compound. Abraham could marry his half-sister Sarah without any health concerns because the genetic pool was still relatively pure. This genetic excellence, combined with the perfect environment, created the ideal conditions for human beings to live nearly 1,000 years. The climate of the pre-flood world was remarkably stable and uniform across the entire planet. There were no ice caps, no deserts, and no extreme weather conditions. Genesis 2:5-6 gives us a clue about the climate. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. The earth was watered by a gentle mist system, rather than violent storms and rainfall. This created a perfectly controlled watering system that maintained optimal humidity levels everywhere. The temperature was consistently warm and pleasant from pole to pole, creating a tropical paradise that extended across the entire globe. There were no hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, or other extreme weather events that stress the human body and shorten life. The barometric pressure remained stable, eliminating the health problems that come with weather changes. This stable climate meant that people never had to deal with the physical stress of adapting to extreme temperatures or weather conditions. The human body could maintain its optimal function without having to constantly adjust to environmental changes. This climatic perfection was another crucial factor that supported the incredible longevity of the early patriarchs. They lived in a world where every day was like the perfect spring day, with ideal temperature, humidity, and atmospheric conditions that supported life and health. Perhaps most importantly, the pre-flood world was characterized by humanity's close relationship with God and the absence of systematic sin. Genesis 3:8 tells us that before the fall, God would walk in the garden in the cool of the day, indicating regular, intimate fellowship between the Creator and His creation. Even after the fall, this intimacy with God continued for many generations. As we see with men like Enoch who walked with God, this close relationship with the source of all life had profound effects on human longevity. Sin brings death, but righteousness brings life. The early generations, while not perfect, maintained a much closer relationship with God than later generations. They had direct access to divine wisdom, protection, and blessing. Prayer wasn't just a religious exercise, it was actual communication with their Creator. This spiritual dimension cannot be ignored when considering their extraordinary lifespans. The absence of systematic sin meant that society functioned more harmoniously. There was less violence, less stress, and less of the social chaos that takes a toll on human health. People lived in peace with one another and with their environment. The curse of sin was present but not yet fully developed in its destructive power. The full effects of sin would gradually unfold over the centuries, but in the early generations, humanity still enjoyed much of the divine blessing that had been pronounced at creation. This spiritual factor was perhaps the most important element in supporting the nearly 1,000-year lifespans of the early patriarchs. The earth itself was young and at the peak of its natural resources and vitality. Everything was fresh, new, and functioning at optimal capacity. The soil was incredibly fertile, having never been depleted by centuries of farming. The mineral content was perfectly balanced, providing ideal nutrition for both plants and the humans who ate them. The water was pure and uncontaminated, free from the pollution and chemicals that affect our water supply today. The air was clean and fresh, with optimal oxygen levels and no industrial pollutants. The entire ecosystem was in perfect balance, with no extinctions, no environmental damage, and no resource depletion. Genesis 1:11-12 describes how the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Everything was producing at its maximum potential. The earth had not yet experienced the geological catastrophes, climate changes, and environmental degradation that would come later. Natural resources were abundant and easily accessible. There were no shortages, no famines, and no environmental stresses that would compromise human health. The magnetic field of the Earth was stronger, providing additional protection from cosmic radiation. The entire planet was like a carefully maintained garden designed to support life in the most optimal way possible. This youthful, vibrant Earth provided the perfect foundation for the extraordinary longevity that characterized the pre-flood world. The minerals and trace elements in the pre-flood Earth were perfectly distributed and easily accessible to plant life. The soil composition was ideal, containing all the nutrients necessary for optimal plant growth and human nutrition. Unlike today's depleted soils that require artificial fertilizers, the original Earth was naturally rich in calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc, and dozens of other essential minerals. These minerals were then concentrated in the fruits and vegetables that people ate, providing their bodies with everything needed for optimal cellular function. The water sources were pure springs and rivers that emerged from underground aquifers, completely free from contamination. These pristine water sources contained natural minerals in perfect balance, creating what we might call nature's perfect mineral water. The absence of industrial pollution, chemical runoff, and environmental toxins meant that every breath of air, every drink of water, and every bite of food contributed to health and longevity, rather than causing gradual poisoning as happens in our modern world. The biological systems of the pre-flood world operated at peak efficiency. Plants grew larger, stronger, and more nutritious than anything we see today. Trees produced fruit year-round in this perfect climate, ensuring a constant supply of fresh, living food. The lack of harmful insects, plant diseases, and environmental stresses meant that plants could devote all their energy to producing maximum nutrition. Fruits were probably several times larger than modern varieties and packed with concentrated vitamins, minerals, and life-giving compounds. The entire food chain was perfectly balanced, with no parasites, no harmful bacteria, and no toxic plants. Everything that grew from the earth was safe and beneficial for human consumption. This perfect agricultural system provided not just survival, nutrition, but optimal nutrition that supported incredibly long, healthy lives. The absence of natural disasters and geological instability meant that people could live their entire lives without fear of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, or other catastrophic events. The Earth's crust was stable. The continents were in their ideal positions, and there were no tectonic shifts or geological upheavals. Mountain ranges were perfectly positioned to create ideal weather patterns, and the Earth's rotation was stable and consistent. The absence of violent weather meant that people never experienced the stress of survival situations. They didn't have to build storm shelters, flee from hurricanes, or endure droughts and famines. This peaceful, stable environment allowed the human nervous system to remain calm and relaxed, contributing significantly to longevity. Chronic stress is one of the major factors that shortens life today, but the early patriarchs lived in a world completely free from environmental stress and natural disasters. The astronomical conditions were also perfectly aligned for supporting life. The Earth's orbit was stable, maintaining perfect distance from the sun for optimal temperature. The moon's position created ideal tidal effects that helped regulate the Earth's climate and ocean systems. The solar radiation reaching Earth was filtered through the atmospheric vapor canopy, providing warmth and light without the harmful effects we experience today. There were no solar flares or cosmic events that could disrupt life on Earth. The entire solar system functioned like a perfectly tuned machine, with every celestial body in its ideal position to support life on Earth. This cosmic harmony contributed to the stable, life-supporting conditions that allowed humans to live for nearly 1,000 years. The Great Flood changed everything. When the waters receded and Noah stepped off the ark, he entered a world that would never again be the same. The perfect conditions that had supported nearly 1,000-year lifespans were gone forever, and humanity would now experience a gradual but steady decline in longevity. Noah himself became the living bridge between two completely different eras of human history. Genesis 9:29 tells us that all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Noah's 950 years made him a unique figure in human history. He was the last man to live in both the pre-flood and post-flood worlds. For 600 years, Noah lived in the perfect world that had existed since creation. He experienced the ideal climate, the pure environment, and the optimal conditions that allowed his ancestors to live such incredibly long lives. Then came the flood, and for the remaining 350 years of his life, Noah witnessed the harsh reality of a changed world. The contrast must have been overwhelming. Noah remembered what the world was like when everything was perfect, and now he watched as his own descendants began dying at younger and younger ages. His 950 years spanned the greatest transition in human history, from the golden age of longevity to the beginning of shortened lifespans. Noah had walked with God before the flood, experiencing divine protection and blessing. Even after the flood, God established a covenant with Noah, as recorded in Genesis 9:11. "And I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth." This covenant relationship helped sustain Noah's life even in the changed world, but it couldn't restore the perfect conditions that had been lost forever. And longevity among different population groups. Reu, Peleg's son, lived exactly the same number of years as his father, 239 years. Genesis 11:20-21 state. The dramatic change became immediately apparent with Noah's son, Shem. Genesis 11:10-11 records that Shem lived after he begat Arfaxad 500 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Shem were 600 years. Shem's 600 years represented a shocking 37% reduction from his father's 950 years, and an even more dramatic drop from the nearly 1,000-year lifespans that had been normal before the flood. Shem was born in the old world, but spent most of his life in the new one. He experienced the flood as a young man, and then lived 500 more years watching the world struggle to recover from the catastrophic changes. The reduction in Shem's lifespan wasn't just a number. It was evidence that the fundamental conditions supporting human longevity had been permanently altered. The vapor canopy was gone, the perfect climate was destroyed, and the earth itself had been radically changed by the flood. Shem's 600 years marked the beginning of a new era where human lifespans would steadily decline generation after generation. As one of only 8 people who survived the flood, Shem carried the memories of the old world while helping to rebuild civilization in the new one. His reduced lifespan was a constant reminder that humanity could never return to the paradise that had been lost. Yet Shem's 600 years were still extraordinary by today's standards, showing that the transition was gradual rather than immediate. God's mercy was evident even in the decline, allowing humanity time to adapt to the new conditions while still preserving enough longevity for civilization to be rebuilt and knowledge to be passed down. The downward trend continued with Arfaxad, Shem's son, who lived only 438 years according to Genesis 11:12-13. And Arfaxad lived 35 years and begat Salah. And Arfaxad lived after he begat Salah 403 years and begat sons and daughters. Arfaxad's 438 years represented another significant drop, this time 162 years less than his father Shem. Born into the post-flood world, Arfaxad never experienced the perfect conditions that his grandfather Noah had known. His 438 years were lived entirely in the New World Order, where the climate was harsher, the environment was more challenging, and the natural systems that had supported extreme longevity were no longer functioning. Arfaxad's generation was the first to grow up completely in the changed world, and their reduced lifespans reflected the ongoing deterioration of living conditions. The genetic damage from increased radiation exposure was beginning to accumulate. The nutritional quality of food was declining as soils became depleted, and the overall environment was becoming less favorable for human health and longevity. Yet Arfaxad's 438 years were still remarkable, showing that while the decline was steady, it was not catastrophic. His life spanned more than 4 centuries, allowing him to witness the early stages of human civilization's recovery and expansion. Arfaxad lived to see the development of new technologies, the growth of cities, and the beginning of the cultural diversity that would characterize the post-flood world. His longevity was crucial for preserving knowledge and traditions from the pre-flood world, while adapting them to the new realities that humanity faced. Salah, Arfaxad's son, continued the declining trend with a lifespan of 433 years. Genesis 11:14-15 records, "And Salah lived 30 years and begat Eber. And Salah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters." Salah's 433 years were only 5 years less than his father's 438, suggesting that the rate of decline was beginning to stabilize somewhat. However, this was still dramatically shorter than the lifespans of previous generations. Salah lived during a time of great change and expansion in the post-flood world. Humanity was spreading across the earth, developing new technologies, and establishing different cultures and languages. The world was becoming more complex and diverse, but also more challenging for human survival. The environmental conditions continued to deteriorate gradually, with each generation experiencing slightly less favorable conditions than the previous one. Salah's 433 years allowed him to be a witness to the early development of post-flood civilization. He saw the rise of different nations, the spread of human settlements across the continents, and the beginning of the cultural and linguistic diversity that would characterize human society. His long life provided stability and continuity during this period of rapid change, allowing knowledge and traditions to be preserved and passed down even as the world continued to transform. The fact that Salah's lifespan was so close to his father suggests that while the decline in longevity was continuing, it was not accelerating dramatically. This gradual decline allowed humanity to adapt slowly to the changing conditions, rather than experiencing a sudden collapse in life expectancy. Then came Eber, whose name would become legendary in human history. Genesis 11:16-17 tells us, "And Eber lived 34 years and begat Pelleg. And Eber lived after he begat Pelleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters." Eber's total lifespan was 464 years, actually longer than both his father Salah and grandfather Arfaxad. This slight increase in longevity shows that the decline wasn't perfectly linear. There were variations from generation to generation. Eber's name is significant because it's from him that we get the term Hebrew, identifying the people who would later become the nation of Israel. Eber lived during a crucial period in human history when the foundations were being laid for the diverse nations and cultures that would follow. His 464 years spanned a time of great significance, and his longevity allowed him to influence multiple generations of his descendants. Eber's life overlapped with both Noah and Abraham, making him a crucial link in the chain of human history. He carried forward the memories and traditions of the early post-flood world, while laying the groundwork for the Hebrew lineage that would play such an important role in God's plan for humanity. The fact that Eber lived longer than his immediate predecessor suggests that longevity was influenced by more than just environmental factors. personal righteousness, genetic variations, and divine blessing all played roles in determining individual lifespans. Eber's legacy extended far beyond his 464 years, as his name became associated with an entire people group that would preserve the knowledge of God through the centuries. The next major milestone in the decline came with Pelleg, whose 239 years represented a dramatic drop from his father Eber's 464 years. Genesis 11:18-19 records, "And Pelleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. And Pelleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters." Peleg's name means division, and Genesis 10:25 explains why. "And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Pelleg, for in his days was the earth divided." This division refers to the scattering of humanity at the Tower of Babel, when God confused the languages and dispersed people across the earth. Peleg's dramatically reduced lifespan of 239 years coincided with this pivotal moment in human history. The division of humanity into different language groups and the subsequent migration to distant lands created new challenges for human survival and longevity. People were now living in less ideal climates, dealing with unfamiliar environments, and losing the accumulated knowledge and optimal practices that had been developed in the centuries following the flood. The stress of migration, the challenges of establishing new settlements, and the isolation from the main body of human knowledge all contributed to the accelerated decline in longevity. Peleg's 239 years marked the point where human lifespans dropped below 250 years for the first time since the flood. This dramatic reduction reflected the compounding effects of environmental degradation, genetic deterioration, and the challenges of life in the dispersed post-Babel world. The division of humanity also meant that medical knowledge, nutritional wisdom, and survival techniques were no longer being shared effectively across all human communities, leading to variations in health. And Reu lived 230 years and begat Serug. And Reu lived after he begat Serug 207 years and begat sons and daughters. This identical lifespan suggests that the conditions affecting human longevity had stabilized at this lower level, at least temporarily. Reu lived during the era of dispersion following the Tower of Babel, when different groups of people were establishing new civilizations in various parts of the world. His 239 years spanned a time of great cultural and technological development as isolated human communities adapted to their new environments and developed distinct characteristics. The fact that Reu's lifespan matched his father's exactly might indicate that the environmental and genetic factors affecting longevity had reached a temporary equilibrium. The worst of the post-flood environmental degradation had occurred, and while conditions were far from ideal, they had stabilized enough to support consistent lifespans in the 200-year range. Reu's generation was learning to live with the new realities of the post-Babel world, developing survival strategies and cultural practices adapted to their changed circumstances. His 239 years provided enough time for him to establish strong foundations for his community and pass on essential knowledge to the next generation. The consistency between Reu's lifespan and his father's also suggests that genetic factors were playing an increasingly important role in determining longevity, as environmental conditions had stabilized at their new, lower level. Serug continued the pattern with 230 years, showing that the decline was resuming its downward trend. Genesis 11:22-23 records, "And Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor. And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters." Serug's 230 years represented a modest but significant decline from his father Reu's 239 years. This 9-year reduction might seem small, but it indicated that the factors causing declining longevity were still at work. Serug lived during a time when human civilization was becoming increasingly complex and diverse. Different communities around the world were developing their own languages, cultures, and technologies, leading to both innovation and isolation. The accumulated effects of generations of living in less than ideal conditions were beginning to show in the continued decline of human lifespans. Genetic mutations were slowly accumulating. Environmental conditions continued to deteriorate gradually, and the knowledge of optimal health practices was being diluted as communities became more isolated from one another. Serug's 230 years marked another step in the steady progression toward the shorter lifespans that would characterize later generations. His life bridged the gap between the era of dispersion and the coming age of the great patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Serug's generation was setting the stage for the next phase of human history, when God would choose Abraham and establish a special covenant relationship with his descendants. The declining longevity during Serug's time created a sense of urgency about preserving important knowledge and traditions, as each generation had less time to pass on what they had learned to their children and grandchildren. The pattern established during these post-flood generations reveals the inexorable nature of the decline in human longevity. From Noah's 950 years to Serug's 230 years, we see a steady deterioration in the conditions that support long life. The perfect world that had allowed the antediluvian patriarchs to live nearly 1,000 years was gone forever, destroyed by the flood that reset human civilization. The vapor canopy had collapsed, the climate had become harsh and variable, the genetic pool had been reduced to just 8 individuals, and the Earth itself had been fundamentally changed by the catastrophic flood. Each succeeding generation inherited slightly more genetic damage, lived in a slightly more degraded environment, and had access to slightly less optimal nutrition and living conditions. The dispersion at Babel accelerated this decline by fragmenting human knowledge and forcing people to adapt to new and often challenging environments. Yet through it all, God's mercy was evident in the gradual nature of the decline, allowing humanity time to adapt and ensuring that essential knowledge could still be passed down through the generations. The longevity of these post-flood patriarchs, while dramatically reduced from pre-flood standards, was still sufficient to provide stability and continuity during the crucial early centuries of the New World Order. The decline in human longevity was about to accelerate dramatically. After Serug's 230 years, the next generation would experience an unprecedented drop that would bring humanity much closer to modern lifespans. Nahor, Serug's son, lived only 148 years according to Genesis 11:24-25. And Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters. Nahor's 148 years represented a shocking reduction of 82 years from his father's 230 years, a 36% decrease in a single generation. This dramatic drop marked the beginning of the final phase in the decline of human longevity. For the first time since the flood, human lifespan had fallen below 150 years. Nahor lived during a period when the accumulated effects of all the post-flood changes were reaching a critical point. The genetic damage from cosmic radiation exposure had been building up for generations. Environmental conditions had continued to deteriorate, and the spiritual distance between humanity and God had grown wider. Nahor's shortened lifespan reflected the compounding effects of all these factors working together. His 148 years were still substantial by today's standards, but they represented a major shift toward the shorter lifespans that would become normal for humanity. Nahor's generation was witnessing the acceleration of the aging process that had been gradually increasing since Noah's time. The human body was becoming less resilient, less able to repair itself, and more susceptible to the diseases and environmental stresses that would characterize life in the fallen world. Nahor's 148 years marked the point where human longevity began its final descent toward the levels we recognize today. The trend continued with Terah, Nahor's son, who lived 205 years. Genesis 11:32 tells us, "And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran." Terah's 205 years represented a surprising increase of 57 years over his father Nahor's 148 years, showing that the decline wasn't perfectly consistent. However, Terah's significance goes far beyond his personal longevity. He was the father of Abraham, and his death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Terah lived during the transition from the age of declining patriarchs to the age of God's special covenant people. His 205 years spanned a crucial period in human history when God was preparing to choose Abraham and establish a new relationship with humanity. Terah started his journey from Ur of the Chaldees toward Canaan, but never completed it, settling instead in Haran, where he died. His incomplete journey became symbolic of his generation. They were caught between the old world of declining longevity and the new world of God's covenant promises. Terah's 205 years were sufficient for him to see the birth and early development of Abraham, the man who would become the father of faith. Yet Terah himself remained bound by the limitations of his generation, unable to complete the journey that his son would finish. Terah's death in Haran marked the end of the era of gradually declining patriarchs and the beginning of the era of covenant promises. His 205 years represented the last generation before God would call Abraham and establish the lineage through which all nations would be blessed. Then came Abraham, one of the most significant figures in human history, who lived 175 years. Genesis 25:7-8 records. "And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 163 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." Abraham's 175 years were 30 years less than his father, Terah's 205 years, continuing the overall downward trend in longevity. However, Abraham's significance extends far beyond his personal lifespan. He became the father of faith, the man through whom God established his covenant with humanity. Abraham's 175 years were lived during a time when human longevity had declined significantly from the nearly 1,000-year lifespans of the antediluvian patriarchs, yet his life was extraordinarily full and meaningful. During his 175 years, Abraham experienced God's call, left his homeland, received the promise of becoming a great nation, fathered Isaac in his old age, and saw the beginning of God's covenant plan unfold. Abraham's longevity was perfectly suited for God's purposes, long enough for him to establish a strong foundation for his descendants, yet short enough to create urgency about passing on the covenant promises. His 175 years allowed him to see Isaac grow to maturity and marry Rebekah, ensuring the continuation of the covenant line. Abraham's lifespan demonstrated that while human longevity was declining, God could still accomplish his purposes through faithful individuals. His 175 years were characterized by faith, obedience, and trust in God's promises, showing that the quality of life mattered more than the quantity of years. Abraham's example proved that even with shorter lifespans, humans could still live lives of great significance and impact. Isaac, Abraham's son, lived 180 years, according to Genesis 35-28. And the days of Isaac were 180 years. Isaac's 180 years were actually 5 years longer than his father Abraham's 175 years, showing that individual variations still occurred even as the overall trend continued downward. Isaac's long life was a blessing that allowed him to see the development of his twin sons, Jacob and Esau, and to witness the continuation of God's covenant promises through Jacob. Isaac's 180 years spanned a crucial period in the development of the covenant people. He lived long enough to see Jacob's 12 sons born, ensuring that the promise of a great nation was well on its way to fulfillment. Isaac's longevity was particularly significant because it provided stability and continuity during a time of great change in his family. His 180 years allowed him to serve as a bridge between Abraham's generation and Jacob's generation, ensuring that the covenant promises were faithfully transmitted from father to son. Isaac's life was characterized by a quiet faithfulness that contrasted with his father's adventurous faith and his son's struggling faith. His 180 years were marked by God's consistent blessing and protection, demonstrating that divine favor could still extend human life even as the general trend toward shorter lifespans continued. Isaac's longevity also allowed him to accumulate significant wealth and establish strong relationships with his neighbors, creating a stable foundation for his descendants. His 180 years proved that while human lifespans were declining, God's covenant people could still experience his special blessing and protection. Jacob, Isaac's son, lived 147 years, as recorded in Genesis 47:28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. Jacob's 147 years represented a significant decline of 33 years from his father Isaac's 180 years, bringing human longevity back below 150 years. Jacob was the last of the great patriarchs, and his 147 years marked the end of an era in biblical history. During his lifetime, the descendants of Abraham had grown from a single family to the beginning of a nation, with Jacob's 12 sons becoming the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's 147 years were filled with struggle, growth, and transformation. He experienced God's blessing and discipline, fled from his brother's anger, worked for Laban, wrestled with God, and eventually became Israel, the man who prevailed with God. His longevity allowed him to see all his sons reach maturity and to witness the preservation of his family during the Great Famine through Joseph's position in Egypt. Jacob's 147 years spanned the transition from the nomadic lifestyle of the patriarchs to the settled existence in Egypt that would characterize the next phase of Israel's history. His death marked the end of the patriarchal period and the beginning of the national period for God's chosen people. Jacob's 147 years were sufficient for him to pass on the covenant promises to his 12 sons, ensuring that each tribe would know their heritage and destiny. His blessing of his sons before his death provided prophetic insight into the future of each tribe, demonstrating that even with declining longevity, God could still use his servants to accomplish his long-term purposes. The decline accelerated dramatically with Joseph, Jacob's son, who lived only 110 years. Genesis 50:22 and 26 tell us, "And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." Joseph's 110 years represented a shocking drop of 37 years from his father Jacob's 147 years, a 25% reduction in a single generation. For the first time since the flood, human lifespan had fallen below 120 years, bringing it much closer to modern expectations. Joseph's shortened lifespan reflected the continued acceleration of the aging process and the ongoing effects of environmental degradation, genetic damage, and spiritual distance from God. However, Joseph's 110 years were remarkably productive and influential. During his lifetime, he rose from slavery to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, saved his family and the entire region from famine, and established the Israelites in Egypt, where they would grow into a great nation. Joseph's 110 years demonstrated that even with significantly shortened lifespans, individuals could still accomplish extraordinary things and play crucial roles in God's plan. His life proved that divine blessing and favor could make even a relatively short life incredibly meaningful and impactful. Joseph's 110 years also marked the transition from the patriarchal period to the period of national development for Israel. His death ended the era of individual patriarchs and began the era of tribal and national identity for God's people. Joseph's longevity was perfectly timed for God's purposes, long enough for him to establish Israel in Egypt and see the family grow, yet short enough to create anticipation for the future fulfillment of God's promises in the land of Canaan. After Joseph, there was a gap of several centuries before the next major biblical figure whose age is recorded. When Moses appeared on the scene, human longevity had stabilized at levels much closer to modern expectations. Moses lived 120 years, as recorded in Deuteronomy 34:7. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. Moses' 120 years were actually longer than Joseph's 110 years, but this represented a stabilization rather than a reversal of the declining trend. Moses' longevity was remarkable for his time, and was clearly a special blessing from God for his unique role in leading Israel out of Egypt and giving them the law. The description that his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated, suggests that Moses experienced a supernatural preservation of his physical abilities, even at an advanced age. Moses' 120 years were perfectly suited for his ministry. He spent 40 years in Egypt learning leadership, 40 years in the wilderness learning dependence on God, and 40 years leading Israel from slavery to the Promised Land. His longevity allowed him to complete the monumental task of establishing Israel as a nation with a complete legal and religious system. Moses' 120 years also provided sufficient time for an entire generation of Israelites to die in the wilderness, ensuring that those who entered the Promised Land were not contaminated by the slave mentality of Egypt. His lifespan demonstrated that God could still grant exceptional longevity to those he chose for special purposes, even as the general human lifespan had declined dramatically from earlier times. Moses' 120 years became a kind of benchmark for exceptional human longevity in the post-patriarchal period. By the time of Moses, human longevity had largely stabilized at levels that would be recognizable today. This stabilization is reflected in Psalm 90:10, which Moses himself wrote, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away." Moses' observation that the normal human lifespan was 70 to 80 years represented the new reality for humanity. The nearly 1,000-year lifespans of the antediluvian patriarchs were now just a memory, and even the multi-century lifespans of the post-flood patriarchs had become history. Humanity had reached the level of longevity that would characterize the rest of human history. This stabilization at 70, 80 years reflected the new equilibrium that had been reached between human genetics, environmental conditions, and spiritual factors. The human body had adapted to the post-flood world as much as it could, and the rate of genetic deterioration had slowed to a sustainable level. Environmental conditions, while far from ideal, had stabilized enough to support consistent lifespans in this range. Spiritually, humanity had found a new normal in its relationship with God, still fallen and separated from the perfect communion of Eden, yet not completely cut off from divine blessing and intervention. Moses' observation in Psalm 90:10 acknowledged both the reality of shortened lifespans and the continued possibility of living meaningful, productive lives within those limitations. His description of life as labor and sorrow reflected the effects of the curse, while his acknowledgement that some could reach 80 years showed that divine blessing was still available. The phrase 70 years and 10 established 70 years as the standard expectation for human life, while 80 years indicated that 80 years was possible for those with exceptional strength or divine favor. This range of 70–80 years would remain the norm for human longevity from Moses' time through the present day, showing how accurately he observed the new human condition. The stabilization at 70–80 years represented the end of the long decline, from nearly 1,000-year lifespans to the human condition that we know today. The factors that had caused the dramatic decline, environmental degradation, genetic deterioration, cosmic radiation exposure, dietary changes, and spiritual separation from God, had reached a point of equilibrium where they no longer accelerated the aging process significantly. The human body had adapted to these challenging conditions as much as was possible, and genetic mutations had stabilized at levels that could support consistent lifespans in the 70–80-year range. The environmental conditions that had been so drastically changed by the flood had found a new normal that, while far from the perfect conditions of Eden, was stable enough to support predictable human lifespans. From Moses' time forward, exceptional longevity would be rare and would usually be associated with special divine blessing for specific purposes. Occasionally, individuals would live beyond the normal range, some reaching 90, 100, or even 120 years, but these would be exceptions rather than the rule. The age of the great patriarchs with their extraordinary lifespans had come to an end, and humanity had entered the era of normal human mortality that continues to this day. The dramatic decline from Methuselah's 969 years to Moses' observation of 70–80 years as normal represented one of the most significant changes in human experience, marking the transition from the ancient world of extraordinary longevity to the modern world of limited lifespans. This transformation in human longevity tells the story of humanity's journey from paradise through judgment to a new normal. The nearly 1,000-year lifespans of the early patriarchs were a reminder of what humanity had lost when sin entered the world, while the gradual decline to 70–80 years showed the progressive effects of living in a fallen world. Yet even in this decline, God's mercy was evident. The transition was gradual rather than sudden, allowing humanity time to adapt and ensuring that essential knowledge and divine purposes could still be accomplished within shorter lifespans. The stabilization at 70–80 years represented a kind of divine mercy, preventing human lifespans from declining to levels that would make meaningful life impossible, while still reflecting the reality of human mortality and the consequences of sin. If this journey through biblical history has impacted you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our community as we explore more amazing biblical mysteries together. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this incredible story. It might just change their perspective on life itself. And tell me in the comments, what amazed you most about this journey from 969 years to 70–80 years? Your insights help make our community even richer as we dive deeper into God's Word together.